So throughout Lent, we are studying the book of Jonah. If you came in and you're new and you're wondering why there is a large whale outside the sanctuary, now you probably know, since often when we hear the Jonah story, we think of the whale. So that's an art piece we commissioned to help us think about Jonah the whale, and each week there's going to be a different word inside the whale that speaks to a little bit about the sign of Jonah that Jesus talks about. What do we need to bury within the whale so it finds new life? So this week we're continuing the Jonah story. But first I want to tell you a different story. There's a man named Patrick. And one day out of the blue he decided he wanted to leave his wife and children. So he got in his car and he went to McDonald's. He ordered a Big Mac, no cheese or onions, and a large Mr. Pibb. He then went to the Citgo station and he filled up his Ford Festiva, got on I-74 East to connect to I-55 South so he could go to Albuquerque. Now, as I'm telling that story, are you wondering why he ordered no onions and cheese on his Big Mac? Are you questioning his choice of a Ford Festiva, which you might want to do? Are you wondering why Albuquerque? Are you kind of trying to figure out why does Patrick all of a sudden want to leave his wife and children? You had this big thing at the beginning. He wants to leave his wife and children, and then we had these details about Mr. Pibb and McDonald's and a Ford Festiva. And you're left wondering, why? Why does he want to leave his wife and children? We saw last week at the beginning of Jonah's story that his story starts with disobedience. God says, go to Nineveh, and Jonah's like, no thank you, I will go somewhere else. And then we get all these details about what port he goes to, Joppa, that he paid the fare, that he got on the boat, and that he sailed to Tarshish. Remember, Tarshish is on the other side of the world. It's in southern Spain. It's this kind of paradise community. Lots of details that don't seem all that important, but know why. At the very beginning, he's like, I don't want to go to Nineveh. No thanks, God. I want to flee from you. But we don't know why. So we pick up the story today, Jonah 1, verse 4 through verse 17, the end of chapter 1. So Jonah's on the boat, and it says, but the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God. They threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. The captain came and said to him, what are you doing asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps the God will spare us the thought so that we do not perish. The sailors said to one another, come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this calamity has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, tell us why this calamity has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you? I am a Hebrew, he replied. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and dry land. Then the men were even more afraid and said to him, what is this that you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them so. Then they said to him, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea was growing more and more tempestuous. He said to them, pick me up and throw me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great storm has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to bring the ship back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more stormy against them. Then they cried out to the Lord, please, O Lord, we pray, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not make us guilty of innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done it as it pleased you. So they picked Jonah up, and threw him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord even more, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. But the Lord provided a large fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So today's part of the story gives us some more details. Big storm, big sea storm. Sailors are trying to figure out why this is happening. How do they calm the sea? Because they don't want to die. It makes sense. They cast lots to figure out in kind of this pagan ritual whose fault this storm is. They figure out it's Jonah. Jonah tells them, yeah, this is who I am. I'm running from God. The people are like, uh-oh. What are we going to do to calm the storm down? And Jonah says, just throw me overboard. He's ready to die. He's fleeing from God. He's on a boat. And at the end, he's just like, just toss me overboard. Just let me die. Why? Why would Jonah choose this? Why would he choose to flee, to hide, and then to die? Why do any of us do the things we do? Ever thought about that? Why does the teen walk into a movie theater and shoot random people? Why do we gossip and say mean things about people we claim are our friends? Why do we take our loved ones for granted so often? Why are we afraid to be vulnerable? Why can't we ask for help when we really need it? Why does the young girl in the horror movie decide to follow the creepy sound down into the unlit basement, even though you were clearly shouting at her through the TV not to? Why do people do the things they do? Why does Jonah think his best option is to flee and then die? You're in a conversation with your spouse or your friend, and the temperament in the room is getting kind of heated. You know you're headed towards an argument. Anyone ever been there before? Never. And so there's this shelf of things you can say next. There's this teddy bear. You can pick that. It's a nice, loving thing that can calm the situation down. There's the dagger, the sharp precision strike you know is going to hurt, but they'll recover. And then there's the grenade labeled, do not touch. That's the one thing you should not say under any circumstances because things are going to get bad. There's a pause in the conversation. You reach for the shelf. And what do you pick? You pick the grenade, you pull the pin, and you let it fly. And then everything gets worse. Why do we do that? Why do we say the thing we know we shouldn't say? Everything in us is saying, don't say this, don't do this, and then that's exactly what you do. Why do we keep doing the things that hurt ourselves and hurt others over and over again? Why? That's the real questions. We often like to entertain ourselves with the what question. What happened? How many? What were the results? But the big question that often eludes us is, why? God says, go to Nineveh, and Jonah goes the other way. These sailors do everything they can to make the boat lighter so it won't sink. They throw the cargo overboard. That's the valuable part of the ship. That's why they're sailing in the first place. They're willing to throw out their livelihood in order to survive. And while they're doing that, Jonah's in the bottom of the boat taking a cat nap. The sailors start crying out to their own gods, any god that will hear them, God, save us. And Jonah is asleep and silent. The sailors are doing everything they can to preserve Jonah's life. Even when Jonah says, throw me in the sea, if you notice, it says, nevertheless, they tried to row through the storm. They wanted to save him. They didn't want him to die. And Jonah's like, kill me, I don't care. We know what's happening. We don't know why it's happening this way. Have you ever found that to be the case in life? You know what's happening. You just don't know why it's happening. The pagan sailors are the ones who pray and offer sacrifices to God while God's prophet just sleeps. The pagan sailors still do all they can to save him while Jonah just decides to die. The pagan sailors learn to respect and worship God because they realize God controls the sea and they are not in control, while Jonah still disobeys and thinks he can control God. And we'd think it'd be reversed, wouldn't you? That Jonah should be teaching and modeling what it means to follow God to these pagan sailors because he's the prophet of God. He's the messenger of God. But in this story of Jonah, things don't work the way they're supposed to. In our world, Christians are always the ones who practice love, help others, and they treat everyone kindly and fairly. And it's those unchurched people and those people of other faiths who talk bad about people behind their back and are filled with hate and judgment and don't lift a finger to help anyone. Is that how our world works? That's often the illusion we've held on to for a long time. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys. How many of you have experienced that life isn't that simple? Have you found yourself at one time or another in the world of Jonah, where those who do not profess faith in God seem to care more for human life, have more compassion, and care for those in need than some who do claim to follow God? Have you become disillusioned? Sometimes our boxes and our categories and our labeling systems don't work, but we still try to hold on to our illusions that they do. This is what Jesus does with the parable of the Good Samaritan. The people are like, what? Samaritans are evil. We hate them. How is he the one that helps the wounded man? How is he our neighbor? How can I see him as my neighbor? He's my enemy. In a couple of weeks, we're going to learn why the Samaritans were so hated by the Jews. And it actually has a lot to do with the story of Jonah. But for now, they just couldn't get the idea that a Samaritan could be their neighbor and someone who helped. There's a story in the news recently about an attack on a bus in Africa. Some terrorists came onto a bus and ordered the people on the bus to split up. We want Muslims over here. We want Christians over here. The idea was they were going to kill the Christians. But the Muslims refused to move. They said, no. We're all children of God here. You will not separate us out. Typically, if we follow the news cycle, the media, we might think, well, the Muslims would probably want to kill those Christians. But they're the heroes of the story. They're the ones trying to find peace and standing up for these Christians. How often have Christians stood up for Muslims in that way? Sometimes the world doesn't work the way we thought it was supposed to work. As a new parent, you read all these baby books that tell you what babies are going to be like. They tell you everything that you are to expect. There's a book about that, I think. And then you know what, if the baby does this, then you do this. If you do this, the baby will do this. And everything's going to work out great. And then your child becomes a toddler. And categories are blown. And often your mind is blown. It doesn't work like the book always says. It doesn't work like your mom or your dad told you it would. Well, if you just do this, that'll calm them right down. I'm doing that, Mom. It's not helping. Sometimes the world doesn't work the way we think it's supposed to. The book of Jonah takes these simplistic categories and tears them apart and destroys our illusions. So in a story where nothing makes sense, what's the point? The story makes Jonah appear very silly and petty and petulant, as if Jonah can fake out God by running in the opposite direction, sailing on a boat. God made the sea, but you got me there, Jonah, with that spin move to Tarshish. It's not like the prophets or Christians could be like, nope, not going to listen, not going to share your love with the world, God, or your justice. And then God will say, well, gosh darn. I guess my hands are tied, the best laid plans of mice and men, and I guess God, you know how it goes. Is that how the world works? Where we can say, no thanks, God, and God's like, well, gosh, my plans are ruined now. If you remember the story we've gone and talked about in the Gospel of Mark with the resurrection, the Gospel of Mark ends with this idea that the women who are at the empty tomb run away and are silent out of fear, say nothing to no one. And that's the end of the book. The people who hear the news of the resurrection don't say anything. So that's the end of the story, right? No one knows about the resurrection. Is that how the story ended, though? How many people have heard the good news of Jesus' resurrection? You should all be raising your hands, I hope. If not, we haven't done a very good job here. But the women didn't say anything. Doesn't that ruin the story? Our fear, our disobedience, even our failures, even with our best intentions, do not hinder the plan and purposes of God. God will use even a prophet's disobedience. God's purposes find fulfillment with you or through you or around you. God's love and blessings always find a way. God makes a way in the wilderness or the sea because God's purposes are for everyone from Nineveh to Tarshish to the boats in between. Just look at Matthew 12 real quick. So in Matthew 12, Jesus is being pressured by religious leaders to do some kind of sign or trick to prove he has power. The people are like, give us a sign, Jesus, dazzle us. Take a lady, put her in a box, cut her in half, put her back together or something. We want to be wowed. So Jesus says in Matthew 12, then some of the scribes and Pharisees said to him, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, an evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was for 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so for 3 days and 3 nights the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. The people of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the proclamation of Jonah and see something greater than Jonah is here. Jesus says, you asked for a sign, I'll give you a sign. It's a sign of Jonah. Jesus connects everything he is doing to Jonah getting thrown over the side of the boat. The sign Jesus gives, the sign of Jonah. The death of illusions. See, Jonah remains under the illusion that he can thwart God's plans, that he can flee from the presence of God, that if he goes to sleep and closes his eyes and sticks his fingers in his ears and hums real loud, then God won't be in his midst. He even believes that death is an escape from God, the God of life and death. Even with the storm raging, the sailors praising, he holds on to his illusions that he can opt out of God's purposes. Just pay a small tax. He's okay. He can opt out. Illusions are like that. We don't give them up easily. In fact, we don't normally give them up at all until they stop working for us altogether. There are storms that blow up out of nowhere and upset our agendas. And like Jonah, sometimes the only thing that can save us is to be thrown overboard and have our illusions just stripped away. Sometimes these storms bring with them a kind of salvation. They rescue us from ourselves because we are never more open to God's bigness than we are aware of our own smallness and helplessness. Jonah's hang-up is that he doesn't want to face the darkness in Nineveh, but one wonders if he's running just as much from the darkness in himself. He's under the illusion that he is right and God is wrong, that he knows what is best for Nineveh and that he knows what justice means. See, this Lent, God is inviting us to give up our petty illusions. When we say someone's disillusioned, what we often mean is that they are cynical or pessimistic. They've had a rough go of things and they've stopped hoping and only see the negative in things. In part, that's true. Our hopes and expectations can only be crushed so many times before we simply give them up altogether. Better not to be disappointed than to be let down again. Yet it seems that God is looking for disillusioned people because they're the only ones who stand a chance of seeing the world as he sees it. God is longing for people to move from illusion to prayer, from false certainty to true uncertainty, and for many safe gods to the God whose love has no limit. But for the moment, Jonah is so deeply entrenched in his illusion that he simply refuses to pray. He needs the illusion to die, to be swallowed by a fish and reside there in the heart of the earth for 3 days until he will be spit out new, disillusioned. There are many illusions about Jesus. He was a zealot. He was a mighty king like David, a military leader, a fanatic, a revolutionary, a simple teacher who had some good stories to tell. All those illusions were shattered when he died. And when he rose, the illusions were gone and the truth was plain. Those now disillusioned saw the truth of what he had been saying all along. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. This Lent, Let's put to death our illusions. Let's let the whale swallow our illusions about ourselves, about our neighbors, about our God. Let's begin to see the truth of who God is and who God calls us to be. Let's become disillusioned. Let us pray.